Hello, everybody. It's good to see everyone. Hello, everyone in the chat. So great to see everyone here. Hello, hello. Welcome or welcome back to the Laurier Milton Lecture Series with the Milton Public Library. This is our last Laurier lecture of the 2020-2021 series. And I know for me, this series was a bright spot and something I could look forward to each month. Thank you to everyone that's joined us along the way. Thank you, of course, to the Milton Public Library. What a beautiful partnership, a long-standing partnership. So thank you to everyone involved from the Milton Public Library. Some small notes to share before we get started this evening. We have time carved out for questions. We know that that's been a really favorite part of these lectures. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. The lecture is being recorded and it will be shared with everybody post-event. My name is Carolyn Hawthorne. I work for Wilfrid Laurier University, and like I said, I'm just so proud of this partnership with the Milton Public Library. The Laurier Milton Lecture Series provides a wonderful opportunity to engage in public dialogue with the citizens of Milton and, of course, beyond in this digital world on a broad array of important topics. Presentations represent the current research and analysis from different faculties, departments, and programs at Laurier. And as I mentioned, tonight's lecture is our last, so please feel free to provide feedback to myself or the library. In our thank you and follow-up email sent by the library, you have the option to do that. We'll be in build mode again soon, and we really want your input. We will also be announcing the winner of our contest after the thank you email is sent. Before we begin the program this evening, we would like to acknowledge that Wilfrid Laurier University and its campuses are located on the Haldimand Tract, traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. This land is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples and symbolize the agreement to share and protect our resources and not engage in conflict. The treaty was signed by the British with their allies, the Six Nations, after the American Revolution. Despite being the largest reserved demographically in Canada, those nations now reside on less than 5% of this original territory after losing much of the territory to settlement of newcomers. But perhaps you're joining us from another location tonight, and if that's the case, I would encourage you to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous people of the land where you reside. We recognize, honor, and respect these nations as the traditional stewards of the land and water. This evening, I am very excited to introduce our speaker for this month's topic, how we caused and what we can do to end homelessness in Canada. Dr. Erin Day is an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology at Wilfrid Laurier University. She received her PhD from the Department of Criminology at the University of Ottawa and her master's in legal studies from Carleton University. Before joining Laurier, she held a SSHRC-funded postdoctoral fellowship with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, which is housed at York University. She has been doing research and advocating with people with lived experience of homelessness and their allies for over a decade. She recently published her first book, A Complex Exile: Homelessness and Social Exclusion in Canada. Erin is a critical criminologist using a social constructionist framework to study marginalization and exclusion. She's a qualitative researcher with a primary focus on homelessness, as well as mental health, autonomy among marginalized people, and homelessness prevention. Thank you, Erin, for joining us tonight. I'll pass it along to you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. It's become very clear to me in the last week trying to help my 8-year-old with grade 3 fractions that I am definitely a qualitative researcher. Thank you so much to the Milton Public Library for inviting me here today. Most importantly, I want to thank you all for joining me today. I welcome you and I thank you for being here. The fact that you've shown up with an interest and an openness to engaging on this subject is an incredible gift that you've given me, and I'm very grateful. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to help us follow along today. And bear with me as I click through these things as we go on. So I want to begin actually at the end. I want to start by, going over with what I'd like to share with you today and set us up for what I hope will be a really rich discussion as we move forward. I'd like to talk about the kinds of homelessness and the magnitude of homelessness that we're seeing today, that it hasn't always been here. It doesn't have to be this way. When I talk about the fact that we've created homelessness, I'm using this collective we here, and I include myself in there as well. We, as a society, have become largely indifferent, and in some cases outright hostile to people who are homeless, and haven't been willing to make the social changes necessary to end homelessness. Second, I want us to reflect on the enormous and long-term negative impacts that homelessness has on people, from their physical and mental health to their own sense of self-worth. The longer someone experiences homelessness, the deeper these impacts are felt. It's 2021, so we can't talk about these issues without talking about COVID. The pandemic has made things worse and scary in so many ways for people who are homeless or housing precarious. But as we'll talk about, it could also be this key opportunity for some big changes. Lastly, I'll end with some ideas about the way forward and how we can make a difference, because things don't have to stay this way. I'm here with you tonight, and I wake up every morning and do the work I do because I believe with every bone in my body that we can prevent and end homelessness in Canada. And I'll talk to you about how. First, though, I want to give you a bit of a lay of the land to help us understand what we're talking about when we're discussing homelessness and give you a sense of what's going on in Canada. And just a quick note, I use a bunch of resources that I cite in this presentation, and almost all of them are publicly available. So if any of these facts or figures particularly interest you, let me know in the question period, and I will be happy to share them. I actually have a whole list of tabs open for anybody who wants to hear about a particular report. So first, we need to know what we're talking about when we're saying homelessness. And so in 2012, the homelessness sector developed the Canadian definition of homelessness. What's important about this definition that you're seeing here is that it points to a continuum of homelessness that moves us beyond only thinking about that kind of absolute homelessness and recognizing the different forms that homelessness takes. The first two kinds of homelessness are what we usually think of when we picture homelessness. So that's people who are unsheltered, so living in public spaces like sidewalks or parks, or staying in places that are unsafe for human habitation. And that can be things like sleeping in their car. Emergency shelter is obviously for people who are staying in the shelter system. The next two categories broaden things out. Provisionally accommodated gets at people who have temporary, unstable housing, like people who stay on a friend's couch for a little while, what we call couch surfing, or people who will stay in a motel room until all their money runs out, and then they're on the street. At risk of homelessness is housing that isn't suitable or safe. Things like a home being overcrowded and not having enough places to sleep for the family composition. It also captures people who are facing eviction and housing that doesn't meet health and safety standards. An example of that is in a research project in Halifax that I got to be a part of. One of the women who was transitioning from homelessness to housing was looking at apartments, trying to find places she could afford to move out of the transitional housing she was in. And she looked at one unit and there was mouse poop on the kitchen counter. Now, if I ever went to go look at a place and I saw mouse poop, I would be out the door in a second. But this woman was happy to see mouse poop on the kitchen counter. And she was excited to take the unit because she said that a mice infestation meant that it was less likely that there would be cockroaches and rats. So she and her daughter moved into this place. That's the kind of housing situation that people in Canada are facing all the time. And this definition lets us get at that. So that definition was created in 2012, but it became clear that it didn't capture Indigenous experiences of homelessness. So Jesse Thistle, who is a Métis Cree scholar who has experienced himself homelessness for many years, worked with over 60 Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers to create this, the definition of Indigenous homelessness. It makes clear that Indigenous homelessness isn't so much about rooflessness. It's not about not having a home. Instead, homelessness is about a loss of all my relations. That is, being separated from community, from land, from culture, and from language. There are 12 dimensions of Indigenous homelessness, and while I can't cover them now, I encourage anyone who's interested to read the report and dig in more into the dimensions as a form of self-education and as a part of this reconciliation journey that we're all on. The definition of Indigenous homelessness makes it clear that as we move forward with thinking through what our responses to homelessness should be, they need to be rooted in reconciliation. Now that we know what we mean when we say homeless, let's turn to what's happening in Canada. So get ready. Despite me being a qualitative researcher, I'm about to throw a bunch of numbers at you. So at least 250,000 people experience homelessness every year in Canada. That's 30,000 people on any given night who don't have a home. 5,000 of those people are unsheltered, so they're sleeping on the street. And these numbers are surely an underestimate. It's very difficult to count homelessness, and so this is certainly what we see as the bottom of what people are experiencing, and surely the number is much higher. Indigenous people are overrepresented in the homeless population. Indigenous people make up just under 5% of the national population, but between 20 and 50% of the homeless population. Interestingly, only 15% of people who are homeless are what we call chronically homeless. So that means that they have been homeless for more than 6 months or have been homeless on and off for at least 18 months. People who are chronically homeless are a very small percentage of the total homeless population, but they use more than half of the resources, like shelter beds and day programs. What this means, though, is that 85% of people who experience homelessness in Canada are transitionally homeless, which means they only experience homelessness for a short time, usually about a month. So this 85% usually don't have very high needs and are able to exit homelessness with minimal support. This means that the vast majority of people become homeless because of a personal crisis, or most often because of a housing affordability issue. The idea that people who are homeless are somehow different than housed people doesn't reflect the reality of homelessness in this country. I said that it's really hard to count and measure homelessness. And so one of our most reliable sources of data is coming from shelters, because they're able to count more easily how many beds are filled every night. And so this data shows us some really interesting things. So the good news is that over the course of the last decade, 20,000 fewer people have stayed in a shelter. So that's good news. Fewer people need the shelter. But, and there's a big but here, those who are using shelters are staying longer, 4.5 days longer, in fact. So what this tells us is that chronic homelessness is increasing. More of those 85% people, right, those transitionally homeless people, more of those 85% people who only experience short bouts of homelessness are more likely now to become entrenched in homelessness. And the longer someone is homeless, the tougher it is to exit. Especially alarming is that families who are homeless are staying in shelters twice as long as individuals. Also, older adults are staying in shelters on average 9 days longer than people who are under the age of 50. This is very worrisome. This is sending up some big red flags, because as Canada's population ages, we're also seeing the homeless population age. And if it's harder for older adults to exit homelessness, this could create an even bigger problem in the future. We can also think about what that means to experience homelessness as an older adult. Not having, I mean, imagine as an older, I am 37 years old and I can't sleep in a tent anymore. Can we imagine what that is like for somebody who's older? So shelter data is the most reliable, but it also doesn't capture that full picture of homelessness. Hidden homelessness, those who aren't staying in shelters. And so there's lots of reasons why people who have lost their housing don't want to stay in a shelter, if there is even a shelter available in their community, because not all cities across Canada have shelters. We know that women, Indigenous people, youth, and LGBTQ2S+ people are less likely to access shelters because the shelters are unable to meet their needs or they're fearful for their safety. So this image shows that while policies and programs are most likely to focus on this visible street homelessness, the person here is often hidden from view. And so what we don't know about, then we don't invest in resources to help them. So hidden homelessness can include things like people stuck in situations of abuse or violence. I've heard from quite a few women experiencing homelessness that they've said they'd rather risk the violence they know in a home than the potential stranger violence that could happen on the street. It also includes things like couch surfing, like I already mentioned. And it also includes people in core housing need. Core housing need refers to people who spend more than 30% of their household income on housing. And this is a concern because it means that they might not have enough money. If so much of their income is going towards their housing, they might not have enough money to meet their needs like food, transportation, medication and healthcare costs, and clothing. It also means that they're more likely to be at risk of homelessness if something happens, right? It's something that we can't predict, like a job loss or an illness. 1.5 million Canadians, which is about 13% of the national population, are in core housing need. The pandemic is a key example of the kind of thing that can happen that puts people in core housing need in a vulnerable position. That's where we're at as a country. Now I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about how we got here. Because homelessness as we know it, it hasn't always looked like this. That many people experiencing homelessness and the different types of people experiencing homelessness, especially young people and women, is a relatively new phenomenon and not something that just happened by accident. After World War II, the federal government invested heavily in housing. They wanted to make sure that soldiers had a home to come home to, and this continued for decades, long after the war. While some people experienced homelessness, it was almost exclusively single men who traveled between cities looking for work. Of course, there were people who lived in poverty and were underhoused, but few people were completely unhoused. So an example of this investment was in 1973, the federal government committed to building 20,000 units of social housing every year. And this continued for a decade. Then in 1984, we began to see the steady decline in federal support for housing until 1993, when the federal government disinvested from housing completely. They left the table. They said, we're not going to be in the housing game anymore. They left it to the private market to sort out affordable housing and put the responsibility onto the provinces and territories. So you can see here in this graph that in 1995, less than 1,000 housing units were built compared to those 20,000 units, less than a decade before then. While this was happening, while this federal disinvestment was happening, provinces, and especially Ontario, were cutting social assistance rates and reducing social supports. Meanwhile, minimum wage stagnated, and as globalization took hold, there were fewer permanent, stable jobs available. So we have this whole constellation of factors that created this perfect, but I would say imperfect storm for the homelessness crisis that we see today. What this means is that in the last 20 years, 100,000 housing units were not built because of this disinvestment in affordable housing. At the same time, those units that were built in the 60s and the 70s and the early 80s are now old. Sometimes they need to be brought up to code. Some are falling into disrepair. And so not only are we not building enough new units, but the reality is we're also losing social housing units that we did have. In 2017, the federal government came back to the table and committed to investing in affordable housing. This is very exciting and very good news. Part of the National Housing Strategy is a plan to build 100,000 units of housing over the next 10 years, assuming that provinces come on board, which not all provinces have at this point. While this is great, it again requires that provincial support that we haven't gotten the green light on all of those things. And it also pales in comparison to the number of units that were built in the 70s and 80s, while at the same time our population is growing. The effect of these policy decisions are real. From 1991 to 2016, over 300,000 more Canadian households became in core housing need. And as we see from the fallout of the pandemic, this number is expected to grow. With that in mind, if I ask somebody how they became homeless, they'll usually tell me that it was individual things, like they lost their job or that they got a divorce, something like that. They probably won't say, well, Erin, I am homeless now in 2021 because of a federal disinvestment in affordable housing in the 90s, right? That doesn't roll off most people's tongue. But the problem is, if we only focus on those individual factors, we're missing many of the root causes. And there are actually 3 overarching causes of homelessness. The first is structural issues. So this is things like the policy decisions I just described that have real effects. A lack of affordable housing, increased poverty, and discrimination are examples of structural factors. The second are systems issues. This gets at gaps in services that put people at risk of homelessness. So because there just aren't enough resources to go around, services have to put eligibility criteria in place to decide who gets access to resources and who doesn't. Systems issues also look at how different public systems support people when they make transitions. So when somebody gets discharged from the hospital, trying to make sure they don't get discharged into homelessness, or when young people age out of children's aid or child welfare and then have to fend for themselves. Both of these transitions are key vulnerability points for homelessness. And the third category are these individual issues. So crises like emergencies, sudden unemployment, or family breakdown are a significant concern. Young people and women cite family conflict and violence as their main reason for experiencing homelessness. And mental health and substance use challenges also fall into this category. All of these factors contribute to homelessness, and we need to address each of these areas to meaningfully prevent and end homelessness in Canada. Because to date, we've really relied on these emergency measures that we put in place to respond to a small number of people in a specific situation as our way of addressing what is now a complex and long-term epidemic. But the way we've been doing things isn't humane, and it's not effective either. Canada spends over $7 billion a year on maintaining the status quo. Simply managing homelessness as we now know it costs us $7 billion a year. That includes things like use of police services and emergency room visits. If we want to put aside this idea of housing as a human right, and I don't think we should definitely not put it aside, but even if we did, It isn't economically smart to continue to do what we're doing. Emergency shelters cost 10 times more than social housing. Now, there's still an important role for shelters as they were originally designed. Shelters are necessary to provide a temporary response to emergencies, not a long-term method of addressing homelessness. I want to take some time now to reflect on what it means to be homeless. While I only have a few minutes, so this description doesn't, fully capture the lived experience of homelessness as much as I wish, I think it's important that we bear witness to the suffering that is happening in Canada right now. The victimization, trauma, and loss of dignity that people experience cannot be understated. Not only does it eat away at their sense of self, but it quite literally cuts their life short. Many people who are chronically homeless experience what we call premature aging. Geriatric health conditions that affect older adults in their 70s and 80s are showing up amongst people in their 40s when they're homeless. The lives of people who are homeless are quite literally cut in half. This is Canada, and we have a life expectancy of between 40 and 47 years old for people experiencing homelessness. Through the stories that people shared with me, I want to pay attention to the way that people who are homeless are dehumanized, degraded, and made to feel less than. So I have a quote here from a young person in Montreal, and in this quote that I'm about to show gets at the structural issues that are sometimes hard to pinpoint, they're sometimes hard to name, but it affects almost every aspect of people's lives. So this young person says, I find that it's already difficult to get by on $600 a month of social assistance, especially with housing prices. Even if you have housing, if you're lucky with some roommates, it's $300. That's half. It leaves you with $300. I even have supports here at the service provider, and I eat from the trash. That's how I feed myself. How can anyone get out of it? You can't even save. You'll remember at the beginning of the talk, I referred to those cuts to social assistance in the 90s, impacting the rate of homelessness that we see today. I can spout statistics until I'm blue in the face, but this is what those cuts look like. Someone who, even if they can find housing for $300 a month, which is essentially impossible, having to dumpster dive and eat out of the trash to survive. Many people who are homeless feel this exclusion viscerally. The shame I see on people's faces is one of the toughest parts for me to sit with. Every time someone expresses shame to me, I want to reassure them that it isn't them who should be ashamed, but us for creating the conditions that put them there. But how do I convey that when they're inundated with messages that they are different, unworthy, or undeserving because they don't have a roof over their head? As Daniel says, I'm put in a different pile. That's for you guys over there, and these rules and opportunities are there for you, and everybody else is frolicking in the meadows, and I'm stuck in the urban jungle just trying to survive on a day-to-day basis. People experiencing homelessness are put in a different pile, as Daniel says, on a regular basis, constantly being asked to move along, being criminalized for trying to survive, evicting encampments, all send the message that they are not welcome, that they do not belong in their own city. One of the things I often ask people who are homeless is how they spend their time, how do they spend their day? And over and over and over, people tell me that they walk. They simply walk. When they tell me about their day, some of the people will show me their shoes and they'll show me the soles completely worn away or the holes in the toes from so much use. Some people spend their days at services geared towards the homeless or public spaces that are more tolerant of people who are homeless, like libraries, wonderful libraries. But some people feel uncomfortable or unsafe in those spaces. At the same time, they're not welcome to stop in any one public space for too long. So even if they can pay for a coffee or a meal at a coffee shop, they're regularly told to leave. And so they walk. They walk in and amongst, but separate from the world around them. We don't need barbed wire fences or high brick walls to separate the homeless from the housed. There are these practical and symbolic divisions that act as constant reminders of their felt exclusion. Unfortunately, the exclusion that people face while homeless doesn't necessarily stop once they're housed. Homelessness doesn't always end with a home. Take Mac, for example. Mac had been homeless for 3 years before moving into a rooming house. And he says, "Where I live now, it's swamped with drugs. There's people banging on my door all night long with drugs. They put it on the tenants. It's my fault. They have security there, but if I was to complain, it's my fault. I've been beaten with bats, pipes, you name it, so they can deal out of my place. But it's all my fault. It's the same with the police. If I call them, well, you open the door. But they bang away at it. I'm trying to get out. I've been on a high priority waiting list for 2 years. I'm at the top of the list, but there's no such thing as priority or caring about me." Mac was a victim of a home takeover. Although Mac was still living in his unit, it's not uncommon for people who've had their homes taken over to return to the shelter, even though their name is still on the lease. Home takeovers are one of many examples of the ways that people can continue to struggle and be excluded even after they're housed. Research from across Canada shows that once housed, many people continue to face many of the elements of homelessness: a struggle to meet basic needs, relying on social services as a means of survival, and difficulty accessing services. In fact, a study based out of Canada found that the physical and mental health of people living in rooming houses were slightly worse than those who were homeless, in part because they no longer count as homeless, and so they're ineligible for a bunch of services. I'm sure it comes as no surprise that COVID has made things especially hard for people who are homeless. COVID has acted as this magnifying glass to the inequalities that people who are homeless have faced long before the pandemic. One of the emerging themes that I keep hearing coming from the pandemic is that housing is healthcare. We've been told to stay at home. It's why I'm in my house right now instead of with you lovely people. We're supposed to be distanced. But this is impossible for people who are homeless. They don't have a home to go to and no way to be distanced or isolate. During the pandemic, shelter spaces have been significantly reduced to meet social distancing guidelines. In many cases, the number of beds available at a shelter have been cut in half. Lots of services like soup kitchens and drop-in spaces have been shut down completely during lockdowns, giving people nowhere to go. It's become difficult and really panic-inducing for lots of people to try to access food, to find a place to go to the bathroom, and to wash your hands. Cities across Canada have gotten creative, as we've all had to in various ways. Many cities rented out empty motel and hotels to act as isolation centers for people exposed to or suffering with COVID, or as socially distanced living spaces. Other cities temporarily converted arenas and convention centers into massive shelters. Many of these spaces, though, are closing or have already closed or are closing in the summer. I'm sure that many of you are aware of the growth of visible encampments. This is happening largely because of these reductions in space and shelter and the loss of access to services and supports, and because people are worried about catching COVID in these congregate settings. It's an attempt at self-preservation and survival. And they have reason to be worried. Research coming out of Canada shows that people who are homeless are more likely to test positive for COVID than housed people. If they do get COVID, they are 20 times more likely to need hospitalization, 10 times more likely to end up in the ICU, and 5 times more likely to die from COVID. We don't know yet what the full impact of COVID will be on homelessness. Experts predict that there is up to a 5-year lag from the beginning of a recession to when we might see increases in homelessness, as people use up their savings and other resources available to them. But COVID also acts as an opportunity. Governments have invested more money in homelessness over the course of the pandemic, and the homelessness sector and cities are getting creative. Some cities are looking to buy hotels that might be for sale and convert them into affordable housing. I'm also incredibly encouraged by some of the conversation I hear happening. The pandemic has in some ways shown us how connected we all are, and that when one group of us does well, so do we all. I've seen a new level of interest and compassion from people about homelessness as the reality of what it means to live through a global pandemic without a home becomes clear. We know what we need to do. The pandemic has shed new light. It's so important to do it. So let's talk about what that looks like. Until about 10 years ago, most housing programs used what we call a treatment first model. So that means that you have to meet certain criteria, usually they also called a staircase model. So like you move up the stairs to show your eligibility for housing. So this would be things like becoming sober or getting a job, things like that you had to earn your housing. The housing first model flips that idea on its head. Trying to become sober when you're in an environment surrounded by drugs, or trying to get a job when you don't have an address or a phone number to put on your resume is very, very difficult. So housing first works on the premise that housing needs to come first. And then people are provided with wraparound supports to help them stay stably housed and focus on their well-being. Housing First has scaled up a lot across Canada over the past 10 years, and it's focused mostly on the chronically homeless and people with the highest needs. So it's that a population that usually requires lots of support. It's that 15% that we were talking about. And we know it works. A huge multi-year study in Canada compared housing stability rates between people who were part of this Housing First program and those who used the typical usual homelessness supports that we always had. And it found that people who were part of the Housing First program were much more likely to be stably housed 2 years later and had better health and well-being outcomes. Finland has essentially ended chronic homelessness in their country because they established a national Housing First program. In 2008, there were almost 600 shelter beds in Helsinki. Now, in 2021, there is only one permanent shelter left. It has 52 beds in it for those emergency crisis situations that shelters are meant for. All of the other shelters, those other, 500 and, I'm not a quantitative, 540 something beds that were there have been converted into social or supportive housing. Closer to home in Medicine Hat, Alberta, they have effectively ended chronic homelessness in that city as well. While some people in Medicine Hat still experience homelessness, their system is set up so that people are offered housing within 10 days of presenting to the shelter. At the same time, so this has been going on since 2015, that they've really had a great handle on chronic homelessness. Concerns that people originally had about, if Medicine Hat offers this program, that people will flock to the city or people will be disincentivized to work because of this program has not played out. That has not been realized. As I mentioned, though, Housing First has been targeted to people who are chronically homeless. But we don't want to wait until people become entrenched in homelessness before they're eligible for help. So the other key component to this is homelessness prevention. We want to stop homelessness before it starts. Prevention's not new. When we saw that people were being injured in car accidents, we didn't put all our money into emergency rooms to deal with severely wounded people in the ER. We installed seatbelts to minimize injury in the first place. That's what we need to do with homelessness. Because there's no single cause of homelessness, there's no single prevention strategy either. So prevention needs to address those structural, systemic, and individual factors that create homelessness. So that's things like poverty reduction plans, better discharge from hospitals and children's aid, or helping people who are facing eviction keep their housing, because it's much easier to help somebody stay in a house than it is to have them lose the housing and have to try to find new housing. Homelessness prevention is relatively new in Canada, but in 2014, Wales completely, 180, transformed how they addressed homelessness in their country by focusing on prevention, and they have seen massive reductions in homelessness. As I noted at the beginning of the talk, thankfully, the federal government is back at the table. And so this comes in the form of the National Housing Strategy that's working to prevent and end homelessness. The strategy is still gearing up, so some parts are in place and some parts are still in the process. So in 2019, housing was legislated as a human right in Canada, which is very exciting. And a housing advocate is currently being established, whose job it will be to make sure that the National Housing Strategy meets its goals. Those goals are to reduce chronic homelessness by 50% and to build new housing and repair current affordable housing so that we don't lose the housing that we do have. They've also committed to removing over 500,000 households from core housing need. So that's where we're getting at that prevention piece, right? Making sure people in core housing need who are at higher risk never become homeless in the first place. I mentioned increased investment during COVID. The federal government has provided an additional $700 million to prevent the spread of COVID in the homeless population. And I'm hopeful that there will be a renewed push for supporting people to move into permanent housing. There are lots of reasons to be optimistic. We have a long road ahead of us, to be sure, but if we lead with empathy and compassion and an understanding that everyone deserves to have a safe place to rest their head at night, good things are going to happen. And I'm going to leave it there.
Thanks, Erin. Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Patrico, and I am the manager of branches at the Milton Public Library. We're now happy to begin the facilitated question and answer period. And if you do have a question, if you could please use the Ask a Question tab, it's really helpful. But I do see a couple in the chat as well. I'll get to those as well. So I'll just start here, Erin. Caroline asks, how do we compare to other countries in terms of homelessness and percentage of population?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. So I actually don't know the answer to that. I'm just going to be honest here. I'm trying to think if I do know. I do not. So, I mean, it's one of these, because I think you're right to ask the question, the percentage, right, or the per capita, right? So, I mean, the United States has an incredibly high homelessness rate. Things in London are really bad. Things are really bad in London. But at a per capita, I don't know. Part of the issue in Canada we have is because, one of the issues that we have in Canada is we're so big, geographically, we're so large, that it's hard to keep track of all this. So we only started, honestly, counting homelessness in a more rigorous way in 2012 or 2013. So we're only really learning now, okay, what is the scale of homelessness in Canada and how does that compare? It also gets tricky because rural and remote homelessness is a relatively new way of thinking about it too. So there are lots of rural and remote communities who for a long time said, we don't have homelessness. Like we don't have a shelter here. Like, no, there's no homelessness here. And so we're starting to say, well, just because you don't see a shelter doesn't mean, again, when we think about that broader definition of homelessness, doesn't mean that homelessness doesn't exist in these communities. So that is my roundabout way of not being able to fully answer your question, but it is a great one. And if I find the answer, I will send it through the Milton Library and get that answer to you.
Yes, we do send out a thank you email. So if you get that answer in the next week,
Yeah.
we can definitely add it to that.
But I honestly think it doesn't exist, but I'm going to find out if it does exist.
That's awesome. Thank you. So Yusuf is asking if you can speak to the conditions in the shelters that make people who are homeless fear for their safety, and reasonings why they may end up choosing living on the street rather than go to a shelter.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to preface it by saying, I've been on multiple boards of directors for shelters. I think there's lots of shelters in Canada doing really great things. What happens though is, again, these shelters that were built for responding to emergencies have now had to manage, in some cases, depending on the size of the shelter, hundreds upon hundreds of people who are experiencing homelessness. And so, shelters vary across the country, but you'll have some times it's 50, 80 people sleeping in a room together. And so people will talk about sleeping with their shoes on. They'll sleep with their backpack or all of their possessions underneath their head because there's a very real concern about things being stolen while they're sleeping. I read a really great quote from somebody who had just recently got housed during the pandemic and said what was a big shock to him was being able to take a shower and not worry about your clothes being stolen in the time that you're in a shower. Yeah. So like, I mean, that's kind of the basics, right? And then because there are that 15% of chronically homeless, lots, some of them are struggling with mental health issues. And so there are people in distress. And when you're living in this chaotic environment of lots of different people with different needs, things happen. And some shelters are better, handling that than others. And so there is a fear of safety. And we're seeing a shift. We're seeing things change, but for a very, very long time, recognition of the LGBTQ2S plus community was just not there, right? And so there's continues to be lots of homophobia and things like that exist. And so it's no wonder that those folks don't always feel safe. Indigenous people, some of them rightfully, if it's not an Indigenous specific shelter, it just doesn't, it's another colonial system. It's another colonial thing that they're put into. And so it can be a re-traumatization of what they've already had. So those are just a few of the things. But really what it comes down to is you have any scenario where you have hundreds of people living together at one time is a recipe for disaster, let alone people who are struggling in lots of different ways and aren't sleeping. And, there's some folks who will sleep in a chair because they don't want to, the quality of sleep you're getting. And then I don't know about you, but when I don't get good sleep, I am cranky. And so folks who are homeless are allowed to be cranky too, Yeah.
Connie's asking, can you speak more about homelessness prevention strategies?
Oh my goodness. Yes, I can. I wrote an entire report about it. So let's bear with me. Yeah, so there's all sorts of things. So myself and Stephen Gates, who is the president of the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, wrote this, which I have in my tabs that I promised I did. Oh, anyways, I'll get it after so I don't interrupt myself. But so we created this typology of homelessness prevention, and it was those hives I did beehives for Milton. It's those hives that I showed. And so we said, okay, there's these 5 typologies. So the first is those structural issues. So we talked about poverty reduction schemes, access to affordable childcare, landlord training about discrimination, things like that. The systems issues was really focused on how do we break down these barriers for people to access different kinds of supports that people might need. Things like language barriers, or honestly, things like accessibility, like even being able to get into some of these social supports. If somebody uses a wheelchair during the pandemic, access to technology to access these resources has been huge. So there's that piece. Then we had early intervention, and this is where there has been the most work done on prevention, and we've seen the most success. It's how do we catch somebody right before or immediately after they've experienced homelessness to stop it in its tracks. So that's rapid rehousing, diversion programs, things like a rent bank, or things like that to help them. Let's stop it before it starts. We specified eviction prevention as a specific type of that immediate early intervention, because eviction prevention is so bad. And so that's things like landlord-tenant mediation, things like that. And then the last one is housing stability. And so that goes back to, once we get somebody housed, how do we make sure that it never happens again? So what do we need to, and so housing first is actually a type of homelessness prevention. What do we need to do? What kind of supports need to be put in place so that people stay stably and securely housed? But let me I'll get that. Please read that report. I worked really hard on it. So
yes, if you can share that with us, I don't know if you're able to share it in the chat, or if we can add it to the newsletter as well when we send that out.
Can I put it in the chat? Do I have ability to put things in chats?
I think so. Yes.
Say something nice, like, there we go.
Yeah, there it is.
That's it.
Thank you, Erin. Okay, lots of questions populating here. Marie is asking, can you touch on mental illness and homelessness? It seems to be a big problem in the area she lives in, without many supports.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's what my PhD was on, was mental health and homelessness. And so I didn't get into it so much here, because I think that there is this misconception that if you're homeless, you must be mentally ill and you must be addicted to some substance. And that's why I really wanted to emphasize that 85% population, because really that's not true. But it is the case that for that 15%, the chronically homelessness, there is a lot of high needs, or what we call high acuity, right? So people are struggling with mental health and substance use issues. And it's really one of these chicken or the egg situations. I just know personally of people who certainly mental illness was they identified as one of the main reasons why they became homeless. And then there are other folks who are said, like, I was fine, or I had never done more than drink a beer, a couple times a week until I became homeless. The trauma that being homeless does to people is, I haven't been able to find the words. In like my almost 15 years of doing this, I haven't been able to find a way to explain what homelessness does to people. An example I do have is, this thing about somebody who is panhandling for years. And when somebody panhandles and people just walk by, yes. That he actually thought he actually kind of had a psychotic break, because he didn't realize he could speak anymore. Because how often do we speak and somebody doesn't at least look up or acknowledge that we've talked, whether they answer us or not, right? It's a different thing. But when people don't even acknowledge that you speak, it messed him up in a big way. And no wonder this basic form of human communication didn't work anymore. So certainly we see a lack of community support and resources for mental health. We talk about deinstitutionalization, the shutting down of the psychiatric hospitals in the 60s and 70s, being a part of this, when we didn't provide community supports instead. And so that's part of it. But then there's also this other piece of the new or ongoing trauma that can come from experiencing homelessness.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I used to work in Toronto, and I kind of, I don't know, made it a point to say hello at least. But it's easy to kind of put the shutters on, right?
One of the questions I get asked is what do we do? What can I do to help? And I understand not everybody has the time and the money. Nodding. You don't even have to stop. You don't have to stop to have a conversation every time. But nodding to acknowledge somebody spoke to you is can do so much. So that can be, if somebody wants to do something, just nod if somebody speaks to you.
Yeah, acknowledge a humanness, right? Yeah. Someone is asking, can you speak to the slide that showed the cost of social housing being $199?
Oh, yeah.
For less than the rental supplements at 701?
Yes, so I can also provide the report. See, I had these waiting. I'm going to put the report in the chat here. So that's the report that comes from. It is 2012, I do believe. So, you know, I don't know how much inflation, I'm not an economist, I don't know how much inflation has changed since then. But yeah, it's certainly, you know, I'm a criminologist. I look at the cost of like putting somebody in jail for, you know, 3 days or whatever. It certainly doesn't, the math doesn't work. And so there's been a lot of these kind of cost analysis about housing first, especially. So do we save money when we do housing first rather? And all of it shows that yes, eventually we do. So sometimes it takes a little bit of upfront money because there is so much support that comes with housing first. But in the end, we save money, and we save money for those highest need people. So if you're also looking for that information, Eric Latimer is the researcher in Canada that does most of that cost stuff on housing first, and that's really been able to show that as well.
Subir is asking, how do we engage with others who view homelessness as an individual issue? What can we say or do to encourage dialogue and offer different perspectives without getting upset? Also, will you sign my copy of your book?
Oh my God, why can't we be in person? That would just be, I've never had a stranger ask this. Like that would be thank you for even asking that. That makes my day so much. So such a great question, because I'm actually doing a research project on it right now. I did a research project in BC in a community that is the most toxic community I've ever seen when it comes to homelessness. People are physically violent to people who are homeless in this community. And so we looked at that community, and now we are currently, myself and a great team of people at Laurier and University of Guelph and CAMH, are doing that research here in Cambridge, Brantford, and Guelph. And we're looking at what are the misperceptions about homelessness? What are the myths about being homeless as inherently dangerous or deviant? And what can we do to break down those myths? So my short answer is, give me 2 years, a year and a half, and I'll have like really good answers. But my short answer right now from the BC project is, there is a segment of people who who are not where I'm putting my time and energy, right? There's a segment of people who we're not going to convince, who are not interested in empathy and things like that. But I think there's a whole host of people who do care. And maybe we are busy, we all have lives, and we don't have time to, devote all of our waking hours to these issues, but that they understand, that they kind of get that this is something that we need to work with. And what's happening is lots of communities and municipal governments are hearing from this vocal minority that make a lot of noise when something happens. And so because we don't hear from what I think is actually the more than indifferent, but like not able to be fully active majority. And so if we can engage those folks a little bit more, then I think we can really make effective change. So this is my top question. I've now devoted 3 years, and I expect it to be 5 or 6 years of my life on this exact question. So I'm so glad you asked.
That's exciting to hear about your research there. So it's almost 8 o'clock. We have a number more questions. Are you okay to stay on and engage with us further?
Yeah, my daughter gets a late bedtime, so she'll
with mine.
I hear hoots from the basement right now. So yeah, that'll be great.
Okay, sorry, I just have to find my spot back here. Okay, so Emily is asking, do you know what the Ontario provincial government is doing to end homelessness? It's a heavy question.
I don't know how to answer that question. So before the latest change in government, there was a committee struck up, which Dr. Stephen Gates, who I wrote the prevention framework, was on, that there was a real movement to addressing this issue. Since the latest government has taken over, I don't believe that has gone anywhere. And in the meantime, we've seen further reductions or restrictions on social assistance. I don't know how much more we want to get into that, but it's. I think that there's lots of room for growth in what we can do to respond to homelessness in Ontario.
Deanna is asking, how does the research on homelessness from Homeless Hub, Map Center for Urban Health Solutions, etc., get translated into action and policy? Do the researchers contact the policymakers, and what is the bridge from research to action?
Oh my God, these are the best questions
Good question.
ever.
Yeah. Really.
Yes, they do. So again, I was at the Homeless Hub, or the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, for 2 years, and my colleague and my good friend, Dr. Caitlin Schwan, her whole project was and is on that. It's what impact do we have? How do we influence change? And so she does all this work on these like series of changes. So it's how do we mobilize government? How do we mobilize like politicians, but then also like I don't remember the word, but like regular government folk that are still there even when changes of government happen, the people that work for government that are there all the time. And then how do we mobilize the public? And so that is actually the bread and butter of the Homeless Hub, for example, or the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, the COH, is how do we make research into action? And so it's something that I've personally taken on. So, for example, that BC project I was just mentioning, we're creating, it's done. We've created a report and some infographics and some, we call them opportunities for change. And we're actually giving them out to that community. We're giving them out to our new community partners. Like we're working to like, what do we do? Another project that I'm on that I love is I'm working with a group of 4 young women who have experience of homelessness. And the whole project is about young women's transitions from homelessness to housing and the impact of loneliness and isolation on housing stability. And so in that work, this incredible team of lived experts are leading, it's going to start in June, are leading these solution workshops with other young women identifying people with lived experience of homelessness to say, okay, we know all this research. I did all these interviews with young women. What do we do about it? And so that's really putting it back in the hands of people with lived experience of homelessness with the support and of Laurier and researchers to say, how should we mobilize this? Who do we want to make sure hears this information? So homelessness research these days, you won't get funded. And you shouldn't if you don't have a way of making sure that your research is actionable. So I'm very ecstatic about the direction that research is going in that way.
That's wonderful news. So Mary is asking, aside from donating to shelters or other organizations, is there anything else we can do to help the situation on an individual level? I know personally, I try to focus on a local food shelter or food bank, but what else is it that we could potentially do?
Yeah, so I think that's great. I think if you have the capacity, which again, I know not everybody has, but if you have the capacity when a project might come into or something happens in your community, to write to your city councilors, because they're hearing from this like really strategic minority that works very hard to quash any advancements for homelessness. And so if they can start to hear more from people who are in support of these projects or programs or whatever it might be, that will make an enormous difference. I think city councilors feel often really left in the lurch. I think they know it's right, but then the constituents they hear from are people saying no, 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 no. So if they can start hearing from more people saying yes, 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 I think that will have a huge impact. If that's even not possible, my answer to folks is just don't get in the way. Like if you're not able to, I understand not everybody is able to be part of every cause, but just don't be one of the people that blocks the cause. If people know that we're doing this work is happening, simply not being a barrier is an enormous help.
Something for at every level, right? Mm-hmm. So Josie is a Laurier student, and she's asking if there's any electives that would teach about poverty and homelessness at the university.
Yes, I teach a course called it's called Homelessness and Criminal Justice in Canada. I'm going to teach it both in the fall and winter. This coming year, I just taught it for the first time last fall. So it's on the Brantford campus. It's part of the criminology department because I'm in crim. And so I like it. It was the best course I've ever taught in my life, and I loved it. And I see Ty in the chat, and Ty was one of my superstar students. So he can tell you about it too.
It's a lovely comment, Ty. Thank you. And then Peter is asking, homeless entrepreneurs can start any one of 200 businesses we provide. Besides us, are there others who have a similar program?
Like social enterprises?
I suppose I'm not really.
Yeah, so there are all sorts of social, if that's, I'm going to go with social enterprises, if that's what that is. Yeah, there are all sorts of amazing social enterprises. One of the best ones, this I don't have in my links that I've already ready, but I could look it up. St. John's, Newfoundland has this incredible program that provides, that has people who've experienced homelessness, teaching them construction skills as they're building social housing. So it's like,
That's amazing.
Oh, and the success that they've had is unreal. So that's the one that comes to mind first of all. But like, there's all sorts of things. So I'm from Ottawa, and so now I'm forgetting it. Operation Come Home in Ottawa, for example, has this this store that people with lived experience of homelessness can sell their items from. So there's also, if you Google social enterprise homeless, there's like really, really cool things happening. Oh, Blue Door Shelters. Yeah, Blue Door Shelter is an amazing shelter.
And this must be related to Peter's question, because Marilyn mentions Evangel Hall in Toronto. They provide a stewardship program to help people to get support and then help them to manage their money. I don't know if that's a comment or a question, but it looks like
yeah. And so that's another interesting thing. So I'm on the board of directors for the Bridges, which is the shelter in Cambridge, and they have a trustee program, and it's actually the most successful program at the shelter. And so it's voluntary, nobody has to do it, but if you want, they'll help you manage your money, and they'll help you manage your money even after you've been housed, right, to help you with that budgeting, with paying your rent. And it's a really, really fabulous program. So the Bridges is another excellent one to check out there. My plug-in for the Bridges.
When it comes to building new affordable housing, what's the best approach to not in my backyard? Wow. Residents worry that building new affordable housing in their neighborhood would cause an increase in crime rate, etc. How accurate is this fear, and how do we address it?
Yeah, so that's what I'm doing the project on. So how accurate is the fear? Research is showing that it's not. That there isn't a heightened level of criminal activity in places with social housing and supportive housing. I mean, this idea that because you are in housing need or because you are poor, that you are a criminal is, I mean, just not accurate. But at the same time, we do know that people who are in desperate situations can also have to do things because they're desperate. So when we have programs that provide that rent supplement, that provide those wraparound supports that nobody feels desperate, there can be lots of success. So there is little evidence to show that crime rate goes up, that property values go down. But I understand that it's a concern. And I think that's, I think it's a legitimate question. And I think people who say like, you're just supposed to be okay with it, I don't think that's fair either. I think that it's important to talk about these things. Housing First, for example, in its original iteration, only talked about scattered site housing. And so because of that very concern, scattered site housing is you rent apartments in regular apartment buildings and people are all over the place, so that there isn't this like, this is a social housing building, so that it doesn't get that kind of stigma and things like that. But it's something that I personally am really interested in exploring in my research going forward.
There's a comment here. Those who are homeless need support systems. Does this mean that new social housing should always be built downtown?
Good question. Such a good question. Access to supports is key. So, one of the things we hear about when cities are trying to evict encampments, when they're trying to move people out of tent cities, is they say like, we'll have housing for you. But often that housing is not in the middle of nowhere. That's an exaggeration, but it's not where they needed to be. And so we want to think about, if you take somebody who's vulnerable, who struggles with, maybe who's been burned a lot of times, so struggles with trust and things like that. If you say you're going to go to this new place, it means finding a new doctor. It means finding a new food bank, finding a new methadone clinic, whatever it might be. That is too much for a lot of people. And so we can't underestimate how important being in a place where you need to be matters. I'm also thinking of, there's lots of, especially moms, but parents with children who they've moved around so many times that they just want their kids to stay in the same catchment area. They don't want their kids to have to go to a new school. So it is incredibly important. And the harder it is to get to those supports. So if you have to take multiple buses, if you have to get bus tickets somehow, and how do you get, then the less likely people are going to be able to access those services. And then it kind of all falls to the wayside because we need those services. So it's not that everything has to be in the downtown core per se, but that's where the services are. And so unless the services move other places, they need to be where the services are.
I can imagine the people they connect with too, right? Who they've met in their circles. That would be a difficulty. I think this relates to what you've just answered, but as homelessness grows in suburban areas, example, outside city cores, do we need to employ different strategies? I know that poor transit coupled with less social services makes tackling the issue outside the city even more difficult.
Yeah, so absolutely. So yeah, very similar to what I just said. Absolutely. One of the issues on that was what I was finding in this BC project is that there's this idea that homelessness is a city issue, and that when I come to the suburbs, if I buy a home in the suburbs, well, I shouldn't have to look at homelessness anymore. That's what, anyways, in the BC project, we were really hearing. And so this idea that that people who are homeless have to stay in this one place, that this is the only place they are supposed to be, if anywhere, honestly, doesn't work either. As we see sprawl, urban sprawl for housed people, we're seeing urban sprawl for people who are homeless as well. And so I know I lived in a suburb when I lived in Ottawa, like deep suburbs, Orleans for anybody who's from Ottawa here. And on Thursdays, which was my garbage day, I saw somebody with a cart, and I just thought, oh my goodness, I don't know how many buses they had to take to get to this part of Orleans. It's here, it's in the suburbs. And rather than pretend it's not, or try to force it all downtown, I absolutely agree that we need to be addressing it where it's at.
I'm trying to go back through the chats now because there were some questions there. This one just says report on Indigenous homelessness. So
yes. Oh my God. So happy to. Yes. Waiting. Jesse Thistle. Oh, now I have a second to do the plug. Jesse Thistle is one of the best people I have ever met. And if you haven't, he wrote a best-selling book called From the Ashes. It was a CBC Canada Reads book. It's his story of homelessness and substance use and criminalization. And now Jesse is one of the most decorated academic scholars that I know personally, and is a professor at York University. Like, his story is absolutely incredible. So this is my plug for From the Ashes. And I checked, and the Milton Library has copies of yes. So please read his book. Because it's just incredible. And I had to take it out of my talk because my talk was too long. So now I plugged it again.
I feel like there was a question that I've kind of lost here. Okay, sorry. One more shot for me. Is there a difference between supportive housing and affordable housing?
Yes. Yeah. So affordable housing is this like umbrella term that actually captures a lot of different kinds of housing. And so one kind is social housing, which is really about housing that has rent lower than market rent. And that can take different shapes, right? So that could be rent geared to income. So we're going to charge you as much rent, whatever 30% of your income is, because that's right below core housing need. So there could be rent geared to income housing. It could be the subsidized housing, right? So that somebody else, an organization or the government, pays for part of that rent. Co-op housing is a kind of social housing. And then supportive housing, right? So supportive housing means that there are supports tied specifically to that housing. And even that can look different, right? So sometimes it's 24-hour support that's in the building. Sometimes it's 9 to 5. Sometimes it's somebody on call. So it can look different what that supportive housing looks like, but yeah, that's the difference. It's very confusing, and people use the word all interchangeably. So it's taken me a while to like totally figure that out, but I got there. So I'm happy to share that information.
Okay, I'm just going back to Peter's question earlier. He mentions here that Blue Door Shelters agreed to a program teaching a homeless entrepreneur program with 12 people.
Oh, so I didn't know that.
Yeah, I kind of
okay.
missed it in the jumble there.
I am such a big fan of Blue Door Shelter, and but I didn't know about that specific project. So that's fabulous. Excellent plug for Blue Door, who do great work.
And that's our final question. I want to thank everyone for sticking around. Dr. Day, thank you so much. This was so informative and insightful, and you've shared so much information with us. And anyone who receives the newsletter that we send out via Laurier and the Milton Public Library will get some extra information as well. Pardon me, let me just bring up my notes. So I'd like to say on behalf of Wilfrid Laurier University, the town of Milton, and the Milton Public Library, thank you again for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us this evening. Thank you everyone for joining us. And as we mentioned at the beginning, a copy of tonight's lecture will be shared on the Milton Public Library website in the next few days. And there's also the previous lectures of this season, as well as on YouTube. We'd like to thank you for supporting the Laurier Milton Lecture Series, and please keep your eye out for the 2021-2022 season, which will begin again in the fall. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.